Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the 1st of June, our first session in June. We have 2 more this month. And before you leave today, I'll tell you what the third one is. The second one, we're going to talk about SOPs and what we're doing here at UAB to provide you with support. Now, the most important thing is you're here today to hear about the device studies. Cindy Joyner is going to be presenting. You all know Cindy, or most of you do, and so I'm not going to reintroduce her, but I would let her do a brief introduction before she starts. Thank you.
So I'm Cynthia Joyner. I'm in the Division of Cardiovascular Disease. I'm Assistant Director for Clinical Trials, or Clinical Research in the division. And I have to say, in my previous research experience, I knew nothing of devices. So when I went to cardiology, we did a lot of device research, and I had to learn a lot, and there's still a lot to be learned. But what I wanted to talk about today, not so much how devices are approved or how the studies are set up, but I wanted to touch on some of the issues or challenges that make a device trial unique and some of the extra steps you might have to take here at the university if you're implementing a device trial compared to a drug trial. So just, we're here to talk about devices, so it's pretty obvious, but what do all these have in common? And they really are a device. Everything from an implantable pacemaker to a stent to a Q-tip, Band-Aid, these are all things that are considered devices. And I think a lot of times when we think about devices, we're truly just thinking about the medical devices that we use for research on a daily basis, but devices have a broad category. So just to quickly define what a medical device is, this comes from the FDA. It's an instrument, apparatus, or implement, machine, implant, in vitro reagent, or similar related article. And it's any component, part, or accessory which is intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Or it has an intended to affect the structure function of the body and does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action within the body and is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. So I think how FDA describes the device really helps separate it out from a drug, which it seems pretty obvious, but they do a good job of defining it. There are, just to introduce you, if you're not familiar with devices, or just remind you, if you are working with some devices, there are 3 classes. The first class is a non-invasive, simple, low-risk device. Examples would be that Band-Aid, nasal cannula, bedpan. These are things that don't typically require FDA approval. They go through a process called 510K, or pre-market notification. They're exempt from that. And typically what the company has to do is just register the device, and then you can find it on the FDA website. The second class is medium risk. This would be something like an infusion pump, IV catheter, blood pressure cuff. And this has FDA clearance. It's required. And you go through that 510K pre-market approval submission process. Class 3 is high risk. It sustains or supports life, and there's significant risk of injury. These are things like pacemakers, blood vessel stents, balloon catheters. FDA approval is required, and that's where you go through a PMA process or a pre-market approval process. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, like I said, talking about the different approval processes. What I really wanted to focus on was some common challenges. So regulations, investigator agreements, costs associated with device studies, and that kind of leads into insurance coverage and CMS approval, along with hospital approval, and then some just something new that's come out through the FDA. So we do have a lot of the same regulatory authorities that govern device studies as we do with drug trials. Federal drug authorities, so FDA, the different areas within the FDA, Office of Human Research Protections, and the International Organization for Standardization. Within the FDA, we do have some specific guidance for device and particularly investigational device exemptions, or IDE, we're going to talk about. But we have a lot of regulations for device trials. I don't think that they're as clear maybe for drug trials, and there are some issues with regulations. So they're constantly moving, you could say, in the device world. But to let you know, device industry, it's a major sector of healthcare. It's greater than $1 billion industry. device companies are typically small compared to drug studies or drug companies. And in the past 10 years, there's been a significant growth. With the growth and with the regulations that are out there, there's a lot of controversy right now in how we can be competitive. You have to be competitive and get devices to market, but still be innovative. And so when you apply a lot of regulations to an area like this, some people feel like it can stifle innovation and it can slow things down. So the pace of innovation is very challenging for the regulatory authorities. And the FDA has been very involved in trying to find a way that they can regulate and provide guidance for device studies, but at the same time allow devices to be put to market quickly. So there are some people on the fence that feel like we need tougher approval processes and stricter regulations in order to make sure that device studies are safe. I mean, a lot of these we might be implanting or using during a procedure, and they're invasive. However, they don't want to slow down the process. And so they put together work groups, teams, and new guidance to kind of find out what's the best way to address that and find a balance so that patients are protected, but at the same time, patients are offered, participants are offered a new innovative device that could help them. It kind of falls under the regulations area, but an investigator agreement, for those of you who have done device studies, this is basically very comparable to a 1572 for drug studies. However, a 1572 is an FDA form, it's a standard form, everybody is very aware, and they should be aware of what the 1572 is if they're doing drug trials. However, for the device world, they don't have a standard form. They offer guidance on what should be included, and that's where they come up with an investigator agreement. For companies or sponsors, and a lot of times the sites, they see the investigator agreement as a regulatory document. However, that document can vary from sponsor to sponsor, from investigator or site. So at the university here, OSP actually sees the investigator agreement as a contractual document as well. So although this is going to be a document that comes through your regulatory office, you have to also be aware that it's a contractual document. And it really is because they're not standard. They don't have the same language. They could have something in this investigator agreement that might conflict with something that's in the contract, or they might add something extra to the investigator agreement that's not in the contract. And so, although sponsors view it as a regulatory document, OSP sees it as a contractual document. You need to make sure that when you have a new study come in or you have a new investigator agreement come in, you send this to OSP and you talk to your OSP officer about it. I will say that OSP is aware of how this is our standard, and so they are working on developing a template that we might be able to use at the university, where if we're getting a variety of investigator agreements from different sponsors, maybe we can say, this is our investigator agreement for the university, would you be willing to use this? So it provides a more standardized form, and it would help get through OSP quicker. So right now, if you have a device study and you send your contract over to OSP, you should be sending your investigator agreement as well. Sometimes it can slow down the process because they might have to negotiate language in the investigator agreement separate from the contract. Or if it didn't get over there to begin with and it's an add-on, then it can slow down the execution of the contract. So you need to be aware that this is actually, from the institution's perspective, a contractual agreement. What it does is, like I said, it's very similar to the 1572. And the FDA does have guidance on what should be included in the investigator agreement. And it's very similar to the 1572. So you have to have the investigator's CV, a statement of the investigator's relevant experience, if the investigator was involved in an investigation or other research that was terminated, and an explanation for it, and then a statement of the investigator's commitment, so that they are willing to conduct the investigation in accordance with the FDA regulations, that they're going to supervise all the testing of the device involving human subjects, they're going to ensure the requirements for obtaining consent are met, and that sufficient, accurate financial disclosure information is is given. So that's very basic, and that's in a lot of your investigator agreements. However, there are sponsors that tend to elaborate on that, and you could end up with a one-page investigator agreement, or you could end up with a four-page investigator agreement. So we always say for 1572, investigators need to know what they're signing. When you have an investigator agreement, again, the investigator really needs to know what they're signing. If it's a four-page document, they really should look at what's in that document and what they're agreeing to. Budgets are a little bit different for device studies than they are for drug studies. They have milestone budgets or they have per patient budgets. However, in the device world, there's a lot of standard of care. And so you have to be very careful when you're negotiating your budgets. Number one, the sponsor does not determine what standard of care. They might send you a budget and what they think should be standard of care, but you have every right to negotiate that. The standard of care is determined by the institution or your provider, and then it can also be determined by professional organizations and guidelines. So just because the sponsor says something is standard of care, if it's typically not, you can go back to them and say, this is not our standard of care, you need to pay us for this procedure or this item, whatever it would be. I would say work very closely with your clinical billing review officer when it comes to this. They can really give you some guidance and some justification sometimes on what standard of care here or what the insurance companies or the professional guidelines are. When you look at the device can be very costly. So in drug studies, typically, they provide the drug. They provide it for everybody. That's how the study is typically set up. In the device world, sponsors are allowed to charge for the device. And so not always do they provide the device for everybody. I will say, based on some compliance issues, sponsors need to either provide the device for everybody or they provide the device for none. They can't do a mix. So for, I think, a couple years, sponsors would say, okay, well, for these people with this particular insurance, we'll give you the device. For these people, you can bill their insurance, we won't give you the device. That's not okay. They either have to pay for everybody or pay for nobody. And then keep in mind that the hospital might actually have to purchase this device. And there's a whole process which we'll go through in a few minutes, but the hospital is going to have a say in whether they can afford to purchase that and whether they think it's relevant. Coordinator time can be very intensive. And so when you're building your budgets, just like you would build any other budget, you want to budget in your coordinator time. But for device studies, depending on the study, the structure of the study, make sure you're thinking about the amount of time that you're spending on screening. If there's after hours involved, if there's call involved, if you're going to have long hours or procedure days, that you need to have that covered in your budget. It's not just a simple 8-hour day or a couple hours for a screening visit. It might actually be a lot more complex and time-consuming. What we've done in our area is we do the per patient budget or the milestone budget, but since there is so much time involved, we've actually negotiated for a percentage of the coordinator paid in the contract. So you might have your per patient budget, but you also might say, you know what, there's a complex study, it's a lot of screening, and they'll pay for 50% of the coordinator per year based on a certain number enrolled. So maybe you're pretty sure you can get 3 patients in a year. Maybe you want to make that your milestone. So you have that in addition to your per patient budget, and it's worked out well. But you want to be realistic about your goal. You don't want to set an extreme number because you want to make sure that you can get that salary support. There are many other cost implications, and so we talked about the devices and the IDE regulations. Like I said, sponsors are allowed to charge for the device, and so you have to really understand what the price is and what's involved in it. So sponsors need to be able to justify the cost. They can recover the cost of manufacture, research development, or handling the investigational device. And they actually have to provide a justification to the FDA for why they've come up with this cost. You have to outline that in your consent forms. So you need to be very clear in your consent forms what's billed to the patient or participant, what's billed to insurance, what's billed to the study. and that can get extremely confusing. You want to work with your coverage analysis team. You want to be familiar with your Medicare guidelines and the primary insurance provider guidelines for your area. So here, one of our primary providers is Blue Cross Blue Shield. You want to know what those guidelines are and how it's going to affect your costs, your enrollment, recruitment, those types of things. And like I said, it can be very confusing for participants and study staff to know what's being billed where. I would consider having a meeting. We're still trying to figure out the best way to do this in our area. But if you have a meeting prior to startup, and you can really sit down and go through what the different costs are in the study and who's going to be covering those costs. Because if the coordinator or the PI who's doing the consenting doesn't understand, the patient's not going to understand either, especially if you give them a 25-page consent document. But you want to be very clear, and you want to make sure that you go over the cost sections in the consent form with these patients in these studies. Medicare coverage, so CMS coverage, typically device category B devices are covered by insurance. So if it's a medical device under IDE, we know they're complex, we know they're expensive, and so because of that, CMS or Medicare has said they will pay for category B devices or reimburse the cost of these. The caveat is you have to have CMS approval. And so to do that, before January, you have to submit a request for a reimbursement letter prior to the start of the study. After January 1st, there's a new process. So January 1st, 2015, Medicare said sites aren't going to submit for CMS approval anymore, the sponsors are. So now, if a sponsor has a study, it has an FDA letter dated January 1st, 2015 or later, they actually have to submit for Medicare approval or CMS approval prior to the study start. Once they submit for the entire study, then the sites, that information is fed back to the sites. I will say we haven't had a study that's fallen under the new process yet. I think last time I looked on the website, there were maybe only 6 or 7 studies that have fallen under the new process. One thing you need to be aware of, though, is that for a while you might be running 2 processes. So CMS is going to grant approval to sponsors, but then we also have to maintain our CMS approval for studies that are already in process. You want to make sure you have a good system in place to track those 2 processes. You don't want a CMS approval to lapse. So it could be, depending on the number of studies you have or the length of your studies, you could potentially run these 2 processes for 5 or 6 years. But you want to make sure you know who is obtaining CMS coverage for your studies. This is a breakdown of payers for Category B devices, and I have to say I did not create this table. Carolyn Whitmire did, and she shared this, I think, in some of the FAT meetings or clinical billing review meetings. But in our area, we keep this table really handy. It really helps you understand if you have a patient that is interested in this study and you know what their insurance is, whether their insurance provider is going to cover the Category B device or not. And so we don't want to exclude patients from studies based on their insurance. What you want to do is give them as much information as you can. So for us, Blue Cross Blue Shield, if you look at this chart, does not cover Category B devices. That doesn't mean you can't enroll Blue Cross Blue Shield patients. It means you have to approach them, talk to them about the study, and let them know that their insurance company will not cover a Category B device. But if they are interested, they would have to pay for it out of pocket. Now, we all know that a patient's probably not going to do that. But you don't want to exclude them because of their insurance. So you can still talk to them and get them all the information and let them make that decision. Now, over the past year, Viva Health and United Healthcare have both come on board and cover Blue Cross or cover Category B devices, which has been a big help. But you want to know, if you're doing device studies, I recommend you keep this table handy. Because it's not just the device, it's anything that happens after they've been implanted with the device, but you want to make sure that they're covered as well. So if they have an adverse event or they have a malfunction, you want to make sure that their insurance company is going to be able to cover them. When you look at Medicare and Medicare Advantage plans, you don't want to assume that if they have a Medicare Advantage plan that their insurance is automatically going to cover them. So if you have a patient with Medicare and your study's gone through CMS approval, then you're good to go. You have that approval, you can enroll patients in Medicare. If you have a patient that has a Medicare Advantage plan managed by, say, Blue Cross Blue Shield or Viva, those patients can still be covered, but you might have to go some extra steps. So with Blue Cross Blue Shield, you have, if it's a Blue Cross Blue Shield Advantage plan, you actually have to submit for a prior authorization. They're not saying they won't approve it, they're saying you need to get authorization before you enroll that patient. And they have some materials that they require. They require a letter from the doctor. They require, some medical history, some information about the study. And you have to do that for each patient that you would enroll on study. Viva, they require prior authorization, but they've taken more of a stance where they'll approve a study. So if you have a new study, if you go to Viva and you talk to them about the new study, provide them the information that they want, you might not necessarily have to get approval for each particular patient, but you might have to notify them about what patients are going on that study. You want to establish a really good relationship. If you're doing these types of studies and you're having to get authorization, get that person that you can email, call at that company and let them know if you have a patient that's going to go on a study so that you can get a quick turnaround time. Really have that relationship, a good working relationship, to make things a lot easier. You might also want to consider creating a checklist. So if you're going to be doing these a lot, that way you can have a checklist, easily mark off what you need and have it all together, or hand it off to somebody else if somebody else in your area is doing something very similar. This is just some additional information about Medicare versus Medicare Advantage plans. I'm not going to read it to you. I just put it in here for you to have extra information. If you are doing studies with devices and you're going to be involved in these kind of insurance plans and getting prior authorizations, it's good to know the guidelines, and that's what the links in here for. Hospital letter approval is an extra step you have to take with device studies compared to drug studies. So maybe with a drug study, you're going to get approval from the research pharmacy or the pharmacist to review your protocol. But with device studies, you have to get hospital letter of approval. This process has become much, much better over the past year. It's more streamlined, and it goes through the clinical billing review group. And I've included the link here. So if you're going to do a device study, you want to prepare your FAP submission like you normally do. Go to the CDR website, get the extra documents that you need for a device study. There's a checklist and some other information you fill out, and your CDR officer will actually submit this to the hospital for you and be that interim person so that hospital can make their review, get back to CDR, and then give you the information that you need. Be aware that more areas in the hospital are having extra review components. So Heart and Vascular has their own review, CVOR has a review, I think the OR has a review, and so make sure you know what their process is for review and their timeline so you can submit and get approval quickly. It was taking probably 3 to 4, maybe 5 months to get hospital approval. I think now we're down to about 4 to 6 weeks, so it's gotten much, much better. Just make sure you work with your CDR officer and you fill out the forms. You also need to be aware that with this new process, the hospital has put into a lot of the letter of approvals that they're going to do an annual review, and they might actually cap your enrollment. And so make sure when you get that letter of approval back, you're looking at what's in the letter and you're documenting kind of what your next steps are. So if they're going to say in a year they're going to review it and then tell you if you can continue, or if they're going to put a cap on how many patients you can enroll, and then they'll review it and tell you if you can continue. It's important to know. In our area, I didn't look at our recent letter of agreement, and it was actually capped. we hit the cap, and so we had to stop enrollment until the hospital reviewed the financial data and decided that we can pick up enrollment again. Good news is when they gave us a new letter of approval, they didn't cap it. So make sure you know what's in that letter of approval and you have a process for tracking it. Along with letter of approvals, you might have purchase agreements, and so this process has changed a little bit as well. I think it's streamlined it. It will go with your submission to CBR, but if a hospital is purchasing a device, they need a purchase agreement. In the past, the investigators were the ones that kind of took it upon themselves, or study staff, to negotiate the price of the device. That is no more. That is done by a hospital, and I think that's an excellent move. They are more experienced in negotiating and have the relationships with those companies. So when you submit your device study and you fill out your forms for letter of approval and all that kind of stuff, you want to make sure that you include a purchase agreement so that that can be processed along with it. Typically, they'll finish the hospital letter of approval, and then they'll move on to the purchase agreement. But you cannot start a study without an executed purchase agreement. It'd be like starting a study without drug on site. But you're not going to have the device or equipment, and you have to have that purchase agreement in place before you can start enrolling patients. I would make sure you know who's handling your purchase agreements and establish a good working relationship with them. It's always good to be able to shoot an email or call them and say, look, we are ready to start the study. It's been a week or so. Where are we with the purchase agreement? And a purchase agreement can take, sometimes it's quick, but sometimes it can take longer. It totally depends on the cost of the device. They'll do a cost analysis. If it's something that it's a device that normally the hospital pays and it's $1,000, and this is an investigational device and it costs $8,000, that purchase agreement is not going to fly through. So make sure you are aware of what some of the challenges might be with your specific study. This is just something I found recently. If you are doing device studies, it'd be a good thing to go out to the FDA website and look. The FDA has started an initiative. They actually started about a year ago, and they've started making much more progress on it the past several months. But they're trying to develop a post-market surveillance system. And what they want to do is create this system. It's a national system with all devices, and it would be easy for them to pull data to look at benefit and risk profiles and analyze some of that data. What it would entail is establishing a unique device identification, or what they're calling it the UDI, meaning that all devices would be assigned this identification number, and then these devices can be tracked. They can also, or they want to, incorporate it into your electronic health record so that they can continue to get data through that. They want to eventually use it for national and international registries. So that's that big picture of big data and where they can look at outcomes research a little bit better. But there's a lot of information on the FDA website. They recently released a report from their meeting, their stakeholder meeting, and what some of their plans are. If it goes forward, I think it would be very interesting and be a good thing, but it's probably going to be several years in the making. That is kind of all I have. With anybody, I'm quick, I know. We wanted to leave some time for questions or any concerns, questions, anything like that. How many people do device studies in here? I know the back row. So I would say if you've never done a device study and you are going to do a device study, you really want to reach out to some people on campus who've done it before. So you can have a good, successful first study. Because it is very unique. There's a lot of different challenges compared to drug studies. A lot of focus gets put on drug studies, and I think sometimes forget about device studies. But they are extremely complex, costly, and they just have some unique caveats. So. All right, thank you. Very interesting. You're from Democratic? Oh, yeah.
You are, and so many of those things are.
It would be interesting if they go more
But I know they're talking a lot about how they can make information.
It's real interesting. The stuff on the FDA, they were, I think they were in February. It was real. Like a 5-year plan, keep it doable. Yeah. It was very interesting.
Look it up on, you'll like it.
Yeah. There's a lot of